Well, Fortune Cookie 45 LC coming to you from the hot lead zone, and hello to all of you casters and reloaders out there. And I've got a question here from Yoda of Coolness. Yoda of Coolness is asking about the Lyman Cast Bullet Handbook. So let's do a VR on his question. So Yoda of Coolness wants to know, in the Lyman Cast Bullet Handbook, does it have a lot of loading data for bullets cast from Lee molds? Well, let's have a look at that. And for instance, let's go ahead and take the 9mm Luger first, a very popular caliber. So interestingly, in the 9mm Luger section, it does list a Lee mold. But it's the Lee 356102, that's 102 grain mold, 1R. And that, of course, is not a bullet weight that we would normally think about first for loading the 9mm Luger. We would look at more like the 115, the 120, 124, 125 grainers. And for those, it lists the two most popular Lyman molds. In fact, there's three of them there. The Lyman 120 round nose, the Lyman 120 truncated cone, and the Lyman 125 hollow point. Now they do list a Lyman 147 grain and a couple of other molds from RCBS, a 124 grain truncated cone, and a Seiko. But there's no Lee 124, which would be a very popular bullet for reloaders. Well, Lyman doesn't have to list all the other mold makers. It is, of course, their loading manual. So, for instance, we have our Lee 124 grain truncated cone bullet, and what do? Well, no point in using the Lyman hollow point mold that's 125 grains, because that nose shape is very different than the truncated cone of the Lee bullet. So let's look at the Seiko, and our problem is solved, because the RCBS 124 grain truncated cone is very similar to the Lee bullet, similar in bearing surface also. So if our bullet has equal to or less bearing surface, then all this data is very good to use, and it is. So we're in business. Also notice that this is cast with 10-1 alloy, and we're a little harder than that with our casting. But it doesn't matter, because if we go with our starting load, the starting load will cover a lot of variables that we're dealing with. So here we go, we got good data. Now, however, suppose we have the Lee 158 grain tumble lube bullet, that's the semi-wad cutter, and we want to get load data for this bullet. That's the Lee 158 grain semi-wad cutter. So we go to the 38 Special, and we find that it has a Lee mold listed here, but that's the 105 grain semi-wad cutter, which happens to be a very good bullet for cowboy action shooting. So that's very nice of Lyman to include that. But when you go to the other bullet weights, you get very heavy into the Lyman molds. In the popular 158 round nose and 158 grain semi-wad cutter, and also the Keith bullet, which is heavier, but a semi-wad cutter that's a little heavier. No Lee molds in this bullet weight range, and here we are with these 158s. Well, here's what you do. There really isn't any problem, because the 155 and 158 grain semi-wad cutters that's listed in the Lyman Cast Bullet Handbook are almost exact same configurations as the Lee 158 grain. And these are tumble lube. So tumble lubes have small grooves, and therefore the bearing surface is roughly equal to these two bullets. And so again, the starting loads are very good to use. Problem solved. We're in business. And the same thing works for the 357 Magnum, because you got the similar bullet weight, similar bearing surface, and the alloy used here is harder, a little bit harder with linotype than we have here in our BHN 18. So these loads are all very safe and good to use. We're in business here. Now I just found it highly interesting for all of our 41 Magnum friends out there that Lee does not have a 41 caliber bullet mold in their inventory at this time. That's kind of a glaring omission, don't you think, on what they are offering. But they have to go ahead and list molds from Seiko and Lee, and also RCBS and Seiko again. No Lyman mold. That's kind of interesting. So as a final example, suppose you have the Lee 459-503R mold that casts this big 45 caliber bullet for our 458 Winchester Magnum, and you want loading data for this bullet. It's a 500 grain bullet, but it actually weighs 488 grains by the scale. So let's see what we can do with our Lyman Cast Bullet Handbook. Well, interestingly, for the 458 Winchester Magnum, Lyman lists the 292 grain bullet, that's semi-wide cutter type, a round nose 385 grain bullet, that's on the other side of this page here. The closest one that they list is the 475 grain Lyman. It's kind of like a semi-Spitzer, very similar to the Lee bullet, you see? But this one weighs 488 grains, so it's a whole 13 grains heavier, so we would cut these powder charges by a grain. But the problem is, suppose you don't have those powders. You got 5744, 4198, IMR 4227, and sporting rifle 4759. And these powders we may not have on hand. One thing that's easily done with the 458 Winchester Magnum is that we can load any 4570 load in our 458 Winchester Magnum. And so if you take the 500 grain bullet here, the Lyman 500 grain bullet with number 2 alloy, and since our bullets are 488 grains and the bearing surface is very similar, we can go ahead and use these loads easily. Now, however, as you recall, back in the 1880s and years ensuing, that they lengthened the 4570 government cartridge to 4590 and 45100. If you look at the case length of the 45100, you'll see that the case is 2.600 inches long, which is within 1/10 of an inch of the 458 Winchester Magnum. And that means we can have the same case capacity. Of course, we'll cut the charge by 1 grain just to be sure, to be safe. But we can use the loading data there. And so notice that we have right here a 480 grain bullet that's very similar to what we have in our Lee 459 503R bullet. So we can use these loads and these powders, this kind of thing. Now that's a special case that doesn't work for a lot of our other calibers, but for the 45, for the longer 45 caliber rifle rounds, we're in business here. Time to finish the coffee. So to Yoda of Coolness, the Lyman Cast Bullet Handbook has a lot of data directly for other manufacturers' bullet molds. And if it doesn't list your particular mold that you're interested in, it has enough similar type bullets in other molds that you can use the loading data nicely. Starting with the starting loads, of course, and maybe even cutting the starting charge just a hair to be safe. So this will work for us and makes this book very flexible and versatile and useful for us. So take care. We'll see you next video. Bye for now.